Some 40 years ago, my Shver, Dan Kukowitsky, started giving shiurim and demonstrations on how Chazal did weaving in order to explain the 39 halachas of Shabbos. And he spent a long time working, researching. He printed a sefer, Maasei Oreg, and he has become world famous, talking to different people around the world over the last 45 years. Anything that I say today is all based on his research, and it's his chokhmah and his shiurim that I've seen and learned from that I can be able to give it over to you today. The Vilna Gaon explains that the 39 melachos of Shabbos are there, 39 melachos, and we can remind ourselves of them by looking at our tzitzis. If you look at your tzitzis, you will find, in Ashkenaz tzitzis at least, that we have 4 sets of rings. The first set, 7, 8, 11, and 13, and those correspond to the 4 different sets of different parts of the 39 melachos. My Shver set these out in what is known as his balloon picture, where, as he says, the 4 most important things that a person needs to live off. Yaakov Avinu said, "Yiten li lechem lechel beged lilboish v'shafti v'shalom al beis avi." The first thing that a person needs is lechem lechel, food to eat. That is the malachas of making bread, as laid out in the Mishnah, chayrish zereh, and so on. That is the set of food. The next thing, beged lilboish. A person needs clothes. Clothes are made out of wool, normally wool or linen. Chazal in the Mishnah laid out the 13 malachas of making clothes, from goizes through to teifa and kareah. The next set is v'shavti v'shalom. To walk home, to walk around, one needs to have shoes. That's the next set of 7. And then el beis avi, to my father's house. That is the last 8 malachas, and that is for building a house. And therefore, as you look, we have these groups: the 7, 8, 11, and 13. So today we will discuss the 13 malachas of making clothes. The Mishnah, Ovos malachos arbaim chasa achas, and we're dealing with the 13. Hagoizes es hatzema, hamelabnoi, hamenaptzoi, hatzoivoi, teiva, meisech, oise shnei botanim, oyuk shnei chutin, beitzeh shnei chutin, kosher amate. Teifa, shtei tefiris, and kareah malos nitva. The 13 malachos of making clothes. So, in order to make your clothes, you've got to search for some type of material that you want to make your clothes out of. Chazal used wool to explain the Mishnah, and therefore starts off with goizes. The first part of making a woolen suit is getting hold of the wool. So you get hold of the wool, and the next part of it is getting rid of the sheep. So in order to be able to get rid of the sheep, you've got to do goizes. Take the sheep away. That is goizes. After goizes is melabin. So now we have all the wool straight off the back of a sheep. Once we've got this wool, as you might notice, it's not very clean. For those here, it's quite smelly. It's dirty. It's got lots of bits in it. It's not a uniform color. You need to wash it. The next malacha is malabin. Washing this, Rashi says malabnoi benoha. Put it in a river. You take the whole lot, dump it in the river, hold on to it, and the water of the river washes it out, cleans out, gets rid of all the things. The Rambam explains Malabein slightly differently. He says you put it into a chamber, into a sealed chamber, burn something, make some sulfuric acid out of it, and that will clean and whiten the wool so that it's all ready for one nice uniform colour, hopefully, and as many bits have been disintegrated and been washed away. The next malacha is menapets. Menapets, if you take the wool, you want to wear it all like this, it'll be a problem. You need to make it into a cloth, and in order to make a cloth, we need to be able to spin it. In order to be able to spin it, we could try twisting it as it is, all like this, but we're not going to get a very good uniform thread. So what you need to do is you need to break it up. If you have a look, the sheep, as we said, has been all year wearing this wool. The wool has gathered a lot of schwitz, a lot of sweat, and it's got dirty. The ends of the locks of the fibres are all matted together. These need to be broken up. They come in clumps because that's how the wool grows. And this all needs to be broken up. The Rambam says that menapet is breaking it, bashing it, hitting it. You lay it down on a mat, on a table, and you bang it. That is menapet according to the Rambam. Rashi says menapet is kreper belaz. And Rashi uses this old French word in a few places. Nozer chaype from a fast pace. A nozer can comb through his hair, can wash his hair, can comb through his hair, and that is chaype from a fast pace, Rashi says, is kreper, disentangling. And this is what you do with your fingers. You can disentangle all the fibres, break them all up, until you have a uniform set of fibres all laid out, ready to be twisted into a thread. So that is kreper belaz. This is menapet according to Rashi. The Meiri says menapet is combing. Now combing, you can use the combs that we have over here. We have combs, wool combs. You put the wool, hook your wool on the combs and then comb it. This is used for wool which you need for chessi thread. It has longer fibres, comb through the fibres, and it's used for wool. Well, there are different types of wool. You think all sheep are the same? Not all sheep are the same. Some have long fibres, some have short fibres. The fibres from this sheep they're about 6 inches, 7 inches long. You have fibres that can be 12 inches long. So the longer the fibres, the longer, the thinner and tighter the thread can be. But that is combing. Menapet according to one pshat in Meiri, and Meiri says the other thing you do with wool is you use cards. These cards are made up of hundreds of different spikes, and they're made for combing wool. So we put our wool on the cards, and hopefully we'll be able to card out and get rid of all the no good bits. Chazal tell us, what does the word shatnez mean? Shatnez is miloshen shua tovoi v'nuz. If you want to have a malacha of the issa of shatnez, we're mixing wool and linen together. It needs to be deraisa shua shatnez shua tovoi v'nuz. Shua is making it all smooth, making the fibers all smooth, and then they're ready to be spun. So now that we've combed this a bit, and we have all the fibres quite clearly separate and parallel to each other, you notice they are quite crinkly. Well, that is a natural state of wool fibers. And that way, when we've got this like this, we can roll it up and take it off the cards. Now here we have what is called in English a rolag of wool ready for spinning. It's rolled up. All the fibers but a lot of the fibers are parallel. A lot of it's been carded properly. They will all be, any other bits left in the wool have all been combed out. And this is now ready for spinning. That is meleches menapet. And this is shua. It's nice and smooth, all ready for spinning. So as we said, menapet is getting ready, getting the wool ready for spinning. Disentangling it, ready for spinning. If you comb through your beard on Shabbos, you have not been over meleches menapet. You have to be careful not to be over on gozes, pulling out hairs. But if you're not pulling out any hairs, you comb through your beard. There's no problem. Comb through your chuk, comb through your pears, whatever you want. It's not a problem. It's not menapet, even though you might be disentangling it, because menapet is preparation for spinning. And if you're not going to spin your beard, there's no menapet. So, we've got our wool all ready for spinning, and it's ready. It's white. The next malacha in the Mishnah is tzoveah, dyeing. So Mashver always asks at this point, why dye now when you can dye later? Why do we put tzoveah, putting colour into the wool? Why is it done now? Well, for starters, it can't be done before now, because till now it has been in clumps, and the clumps and the dirt that's possibly left in the wool will stop the dye from fixing and sticking to the wool and be a uniform colour all over. Now that we've combed it all out and we've got it all separate, we can fix the colour, it will be there. Nothing's going to come off and leave a little patch behind. If we do it now, then as much colour as possible will get into there. Dyeing, the melacha of dyeing is putting the wool into a big vat which has got some colour in it and leaving it there, boiling it up, leaving it there simmering until the wool retains the colour. It's mavua in Rashi that samamonim, the bishul samamonim that the Gemara talks about, is the fixatives that are needed for the dye. It's not necessarily the dye, because Rashi talks about using samamonim for techeles, and we know techeles comes from the chilozin. So if it comes from the chilozin, needs something that will enable it, the dye, the colour, to stick to the wool, and that you use different chemicals or from different plants that is put into the vat together and boiled up together with the wool. That has to be done now. As we said, it fixes better, there's more room for it to fix. If it doesn't fix properly and we get patchy wool, or if you've done that to a piece of cloth and you put it into the vat and it came out patchy, then you've ruined your piece of cloth. Nobody wants a patchy suit. If you do it to the wool and you haven't spun it yet, so when you spin it, you can spin and you can mix colours. You can mix the red and the white to get slightly different. You can mix different shades, and if it's all done in the wool, when it's dyed in the wool as it's known, then you get a much better, deeper colour, which can then be made into a suit and then can be mixed. The fibres, colours can be mixed, and it's much easier to make the suits, the colours that you want, when you do tzoveah at this stage, when it's all open and ready to absorb as much colour as it can. So, we've done tzoveah. The next malacha is spinning. Now, in order to be able to spin, we've got to take these little fibres. As we said, the fibres are 6 inches to 15 inches long, and we've got to combine them. The way to combine them is to give them a twist. You take the fibres and you twist them, and as the fibres catch round each other, and as we said, they're crimped anyway, so they can twist round each other. As you twist them, they form a thread. The tighter the twist, the stronger the thread. So now that we've started off by hand and we've twisted enough of this, then you can carry on all day twisting by hand, but that will take you a long time. So, from the time of Hevel, when Hevel looked after his sheep, obviously in order to make clothes, because what else could he do with the sheep? He couldn't eat the meat. He could only use the wool for clothes. So we have a spindle, a kush. We have the Arabic kush and the European kush. It's called a kush because the main shaft of it, the stick, the spindle, is called, in Chazal, it's called a kush. We have the weight on the kush, which helps it spin. The weight in the Arabic version is the weight is on the top. In the European version, the weight is on the bottom. And then we have the tzinora, the hook at the top, which hooks onto the thread and enables the spinning to take place. The tzinora is normally made out of metal, and you have a Mishnah in Kalim about kush bolat tzinora. You had your spindle and the metal hook got bashed all the way in, it's totally knocked in. Can you be matai? Is it tome? This is a kush, and here's the tzinora. It's called a kush because it's like a lulav. We can ask for a lulav and you get 3 minim. We say al natilas lulav. We get all our minim together because the kush is the main part of it. The notion of the Torah is notion of Tanakh. It's called a polech. So we take our string, our thread that we started off spinning, and we knot it, tie it onto the hook. And then we can spin. As we spin, we can feed in more and more thread from the bunch of thread, which is all nicely combed and the fibers are all ready to go in. As we carry on spinning, we've got to be careful of a couple of things. One of them is not to feed in too much thread, otherwise you get slobs in your thread, you won't get uniform thread. And the other thing is to make sure that the rest of your fibers don't get caught up in the thread that you're spinning. And for that reason, we have what is called a kisher, a stick, and you use that to wrap your thread around. You hold it in your hand under your arm, and then you carry on spinning, knowing that only the amount of thread that you allow in to the spin is going to actually get that. Now, if we're spinning it like this, I'm not such an expert spinner, but as you can see from the different thicknesses of thread, but as we spin along, we can spin and spin and spin until we get to the ground, until our spindle hits the floor. Now, once the spindle hits the floor, we're going to have a problem, because if we leave it like this, then the spindle starts unspinning. And it's doing that at quite a fast rate, and what's going to happen after a while is it's going to snap. In order to make sure that it doesn't snap, there's two options. Number one, we can say if we leave this thread by itself, it's just going to unravel itself. We don't want that to happen, so we spin it up tighter. In order to stop it unravelling, we can temporarily wrap it round the spindle. And then hook it round the hook, and we can carry on spinning from here. If, however, we want to leave it for a longer amount of time, we don't want to leave it on the spindle, want a stronger piece of thread, the other thing we could do is we can twine it. This is a single thread, and if we take two of them, hook them onto the spindle, and twine it, twist it the opposite way to how these have been twisted. These have been twisted. And we find that we have a twined piece of thread which doesn't unravel, because the twists work against themselves, and they have twisted themselves into. This is a twined piece of thread. This is shazira. Shazira is a tolda of teva. It's been twined. This is nuz, according to Rabbeinu Tam. Shua tovi v'nuz. We've done the spinning, we've done the nuz, we've done the twining, and we now have a thread which is good for tzitzis. Had I done it lishma, because tzitzis need to be twined. They need to have not just a single thread. They need to be twined into a few times, few threads. Our tzitzis are kofel shmoina, twined over a few times. I say they start off with things that are a lot thinner, and each one is wrapped up around itself in order to hold it as a long thread. So the next malacha in the malachas is Mesach. Mesach actually says is order belaz. But unless you open Mashver's book Targum Alaz, or you're a French weaver, you won't know what order is. However, order is the word used by all the Rishonim who come from that area, come from France, Germany. They all call Mesach order. What's order? Order is getting ready wool for your loom. Now, to understand that, we have to understand what weaving is, and we'll take it step by step, how to know that once we know weaving, then we can get to order soon. So, we start up with weaving. We've done this as kids. Weaving is interlacing threads at right angles. We've got the white ones going up and down, we've got the pink ones going from left to right, and we interlace them up and down, up and over, under and over, and the white ones go under and over. So that is weaving. That's a bit of weaving here. Jewish history, Mashver says over, tells of what the old ladies used to do in the evenings. And that is darning. What is darning, you ask me? Darning is if you have a hole in your sock. What do? So you'll tell me, if I have a hole in my sock, I go to a shop and get a new pair of socks. In the olden days it wasn't so simple, so what you did is you had to fix the hole. To fix a hole by stitching it shut would do okay if you've got a needle and thread. However, it would mean that your sock gets shorter as time goes on. So what you need to do is you need to replace the hole with a new piece of cloth. So you take a hole, if you imagine this piece of wood being the hole and all the sock being further around it, and in order to start off fixing the hole, you lay out threads going from right to left, fix them into position in the hole, and this is your chassis. Your chassis is the fixed part of the loom, fixed part of the cloth, which is even shemilosh and even shasia. It's fixed. We fix these parts going from left to right, and then you take your needle and thread, and you weave in under the greens and over the pinks, under the green, over the pink, under the green, over the pink, till you come out on the other side. And hey presto, we have one thread in here, which, if we hold it up, there we have going across a piece of thread, but if we hold it up this way, it's held up by the pinks. If we turn it over, it's held up by the greens. And therefore that is what weaving is all about. You're interlacing the threads. And if we go back under the pinks, over the greens, you'll take you till longer than years of Moshe Selach to get your cloth done. So again, we go under the greens, under the pinks, over the greens, and on the way back, we'll go over the pinks and under the greens. And then back again, and so on and so forth until we've filled pinks over the greens, until we fill up our hole with, let's say the chassis are filled half of it, and the Arabs fill the other half. Now, that's all very good if you're darning a hole, which is at the end of your sock, and it's a little hole. If you're trying to make a piece of cloth which is 1 meter wide and 10 meters long, then it's going to take you a long time to take your thread, go under, over, under, over. Besides that, as you saw with our needle and thread, we go under and over, and then you have to pull the whole thing out. Pull, 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 till you get to the end of the thread. And if it's a long piece of thread, you're going to have to pull it a long way, and then you go back again, and you have to pull it all the way through. So we need to find a way of getting the thread through the yarn, through the chassis, and for that we use a shuttle. And we've got a big shuttle. Make sure you've got a length of thread ready, and then you can go much quicker. It's basically a long needle with the string wrapped around it. But now we want to go under the reds, under the greens, over the pinks. So how do we do that easily? So we found the next stage of invention was to use what is called a shed stick. You put it under the greens, over the pinks, and then you lift it up. When you lift it up, we'll find we've now got what is called a shed, and we can pass our shuttle through the shed, pass the area through the chassis. Again. Easily, and we've gone under the greens, over the pinks. We drop down the board, and now we just have to lift up the pinks and go over the greens, under the pinks. And that way we've cut the amount of time we need to spend going unders and overs by half, because when we need to go under the greens, you just go straight through. Fine. That's all very good for lifting up the greens. What happens if we want to lift up the pinks all at once? Let's try and do that. So let's take another board. We'll lift it under the pinks. We'll lift up all our pinks. So now we can come back under the pinks. That's very good. So we drop this board, and now we try lifting the greens again. We have a problem because they don't lift up. Unless we get rid of that board, and then we've got the greens to go under again. But now we need to drop the greens, we need to lift up the pinks. We need to get a board, pick it up. Get the board, and we get the board, and we have to feed it all the way through again. So therefore, using two boards is not very useful, because although it can help with one side of things, we can't lift up both sets of chassis. And therefore, we'll have to have a different invention. And for that, we need to see the upright ladies' loom. So here we have the ladies' upright loom, and we'll see how to do this invention. We have here the shed stick that opens up between the greens and the pinks. Piece of wood opens up an area that we can pass our shuttle between the greens and the pinks. Do that. Now, to come back, we said we need to go on the other side of the pinks, pull out the greens. So what they did was they tied on pieces of string, and then slowly but surely, for every two, you can pull out the greens. You can come back under the pinks. And if you wanted to pull the whole piece of wood, which had all these leashes tied on, you can pull it, and then we've created a shed of a counter shed, as it's called, of over the green, under the pinks. Get this done carefully. And by doing this, we can now go in there. Thank you. Back there. And then back again, in between, pull out the greens, and push back again. So now we have done some weaving, but the important part is since we've got all the chassis threads separate and are all nicely laid out, we can create a shed by moving the stick, alternatively by pulling out all the other ones. Leave the stick behind and pull out all the other ones. That creates the shed, the counter shed. So that's how the ladies did their weaving, and when they wanted to bang it all together, they moved in the charka, what's called a sword beater, and banged everything home. So, just to show you the different parts, for Maseches Kelim it's Negeh, and also Melechas for Shabbos as well, for Muktzah. We have here the Koved Elyon. This is the upper beam, and the Koved Tachton, the lower beam. Now the Koved Elyon is called the Koved HaShesi, that's where the Shesi is all wrapped around, and it's only Shesi up here. And the Koved Tachton is the cloth beam. It's all wrapped around and becomes part of the cloth. When, as the cloth builds up, you can then wrap the cloth on over there. We have the Amudim. The Amudim are uprights, the two Amudim that join the Koved Elyon to the Koved Tachton. And these Amudim, in the lady's beam, in the lady's loom, these Amudim would be stuck into the ground. It'd be a bit longer than this, and it'd be stuck into the ground. You wouldn't have this foot over here. It'd be stuck into the ground. And when you remove the Amudim, says the Gemara on Kuf Gimel, that you'll be left with holes in the floor, because these Amudim stand in the floor and get fixed into the floor, and that way, since they're in the floor, when you pull them out, you're left with holes. These Amudim are Menukovim, Rashi says, the Menukovim, because they had holes for this stick, the Shesi stick, so the warp, the Nirim stick, as it's probably called, would be attached to pegs, and these pegs would go into the holes, and you'd have this stick, the height, which would be convenient for the lady who is weaving. Some taller ladies would keep it up much higher, smaller ladies keep it lower, and you could adjust it to be your height. And that is the lady's loom. So far we've seen Mesach on a lady's loom, on this type of loom, a fixed loom, would be just setting out the Shesis from top to bottom, fixing them from the Koved Elyon to the Koved Tachton. And we've learnt about making a shed and a counter shed, and Emir Hashem in the next year we'll learn more about Mesach and more about Oiseh Shnei Botinim. Thank you. discussing Maasei, preparing our loom ready for weaving. We saw the upright loom with the kovet ending, kovet tachton, and how they created their sheds in order to be able to pass the Erev through. We had the chassis upright and the Erev going across. You opened up the two parts of the chassis with either with a piece of wood or pulling each one with a string. And now we're going on to another type of loom. Rashi talks about a loom in Daf Kuf Hey. Rashi says that there's a loom which is the Oreg Beregel. They weave with their feet. Now how can a person weave with his feet? He has to pass the Erev from one side to the other. It's not with his feet. The answer is he's moving the chassis with his feet. With foot pieces, he'll be able to move the chassis. And to understand that, we need to understand what my Shver calls the Gukovitsky rule of weaving. So, if we take a piece of string, take that end, and we have a look over here. Here we have what is called a nira. The nira is the piece of string, the basnir is the hole through the middle, and altogether it's held on a frame. So if we pass a piece of string through here, and we pass another piece of string next to it, we can see that, as I say, the Gukovitsky rule of weaving is that what gets lifted up goes up, and what doesn't get lifted up doesn't go up. So when we lift up, we've got the two strings held together. When we lift up the green, it goes up, and the red one doesn't go up. When we drop the green, put it down, the green goes down, the red one stays still. So this is the main rule, the Gukovitsky rule of weaving, that what goes up, what you lift up goes up, what you don't lift up doesn't go up. So now that we saw the rule of weaving, we can start getting it closer to a loom. If we want to lift up all the reds, so we lift up all the reds like this. Now we've got all the reds up, we can take our shuttle and pass it through. If we drop the reds, they go down, and now we take up the greens. And the greens can come up because they're held on a separate harness with separate nirin to hold them up. Now we can pull up the greens, and we can work our way back again. And this, if you followed that, is the general idea of a loom. To show it a bit clearer on here, where the two sets of nirin are connected by a piece of string. And then when you lift up the greens, the reds automatically go down, because one harness is attached to the other harness, and we pull one down, the reds go up, we pull that one down, and the greens go up. Each time creating a shed to be able to pass through our Erev, and that way we can get on with weaving. One more important point to remember is that if we want these machines to work, and the reds to go up when we lift them up, and the greens to go up when we lift up the greens, we've got to make sure that the greens and the reds are not crossed over. If we lift up the reds like this, the reds go up. If, however, the green would be in the way, and would be crossed over, and when we lift up the reds, we can't get them all the way up, because the greens are holding it, the green one is holding the red one down. So our loom is not going to work very well unless we've got every single chassis in its right place. Because as we said, if they're crossed over, if they're not tight enough, or they're too tight, we'll lift them up, we won't be able to get the other one up. We'll only get two up, but the third one won't go up if it's held down by the green, or if it's just too tight. So we've got to get the tension of the strings right, and we've got to get all of them in the right place. So now we can discuss and we can see how our foot loom works. We're going to weave with our feet. We have over here a kovet elyon with our chassis on. We have here the kovet tachton with the weft. The area have already started to be woven on. This is where we're going to create our beged. Here we have the nirin. We have sets of heddles, all ready and waiting to lift up the reds and lift up the greens. And these things work by the foot pedals. This foot pedal lifts up the red, and the foot pedal on the other side lifts up the greens. We have here what is called the kirus, or matzuvisa, which is there to bang everything home once you've started your weaving. But this is the basic idea of the foot loom, the ariga beregel, that Rashi talks about, the Rebbeinu Hananel talks about. And again, the main parts are the kovet elyon, the kovet tachton at the bottom, the two sets of nirin, which are powered by your foot, and the kirus. Now that we've seen the loom, now we have to work out how to do mesach, how to get ready this loom. Because to tie the chassis from the kovet elyon to the kovet tachton will be a bit difficult and be a bit pointless, because it will only give us that length of weaving to be able to do from the kovet elyon to the kovet tachton. If we want to be able to wrap up our chassis and get a piece of cloth which is longer than the actual loom for the distance between the kovet elyon and the kovet tachton, then we've got to be able to roll up the chassis on the kovet elyon, and then we'll be able to unroll it as we weave along. So therefore, we need to be able to lay out the chassis in a nice order so that we can put it on the loom. So therefore, we'll see how not to do it. The first thing you need to do is to tie it onto this peg down here. And as we said, we need to make sure that thread number 1 is at the bottom and thread number 2 is on top of it. So far so good. We'll go around again. Thread number 3 goes on top of number 2. And now we'll put a penny in the pushka to make sure that thread number 4 stays on top of thread number 3. And we'll say a kapitel tehillim to make sure that number 5 goes on top of number 6. And then number 7 on top of number. And as you can see, we're not doing very well because there's nothing keeping all these in order. So therefore, we're going to have to start again. Tie one down here. This time we will use these pegs and we will cross over as we get in between peg number 2 and peg number 3. And when we come back, we will cross over again. So now we have number 1, thread number 1 at the bottom and thread number 2 on top of it. It's not going to move because since it's crossed over, there's no way of it jumping up. Can't uncross itself. And when we do number 3 on top of number 2, crossing the other way, we create this figure 8 every time we go past. And that way, we can be sure. We have what Maasei calls the nekudas ha'emes. The emes over here is that thread. The threads are all in order. Round. Come to over here. Here we have a warping board. You can, as you can see, we tie it on at the end and we work our way backwards and forwards and we make sure we get the crossover over here. So even though we started off with the green over here, by the time we get down to this end, you'll find that the greens aren't at the bottom anymore. They're all mixed up. But where it's most important, at the crossover, that is where everything is in order. The green's at the bottom, then the pink's on top. And as this is what the Gaon means, when you can do Mesach, this laying out the chassis in order on the pegs, be it on the wall, on the ground, that is Mesach. When we can, as we said before, we can do it from Koved El and Koved Tachten, or you can do Mesach al HaKaisel. You can put the pegs into the wall and do your Mesach, making sure you have the crossover in the right place. The next thing we need to do in order to get our chassis from on the pegs onto the loom is to make sure we hold on to this Nekudas HaEmes. And for that, we need these Kalei Kivoi. These are very important sticks, and they have to be kept without any scratches, any dents, and therefore they're Muksan Shabbos, the Kanei HaOrgim. They need to be kept carefully, and they need to be fed into this Nekudas HaEmes. One on one side, and one on the other side. Then we use the Chevel HaGardi to tie them together. And this way we have kept the Nekudas HaEmes over here in between these two sticks. And if you look carefully when we get back to the loom, we will see these sticks are still left on the loom. The next job is to tie the other end. We need to keep the other end safe, and therefore we take another Chevel HaGardi, useful pieces of string, and tie them all up together. So now we have this, it's not going to get lost, it's all held together there. Getting back to the top end, we take a Koved Elyon. This is a spare Koved. Remember, they're called Kovdim because they have to be heavy, they have to hold on to the weight of all the chassis, and we insert it over here so that we can, slowly but surely, remove all the strings from these pegs, and we have them now on the Koved Elyon. Remember, in between the lays rods, the Klei Kivoy, in between these we have the Nekudas HaEmes. If you look carefully, over here, this end, can't see it so well, but over this end, they're not all in the right order. So we can try and bring our lays rods back as far as we can. But the Rambam says that the next malacha is shovet. We take another stick, might need somebody else to do it, we'll hold one end, and we'll shovet all these chassis threads until they jump into the right order, hopefully if they're not too far apart. If they are too far apart, we will have to use a pointy tool, a karaka, something pointy, to be able to lift them over, get in between the threads, lift them over, and make sure they're all in the right order. And once they're all in the right order at this end, and the Nekudas HaEmes is held over there, where they cross over, we can then try and roll it up. Now, if I stand over here and roll, we're not going to get very far. So what we need is a Kanei HaOrgim, a useful piece of wood which can be held tight, and that way we can roll the chassis up. And as Mashver says, although we've got hold of this Nekudas HaEmes, but we live in the Alma de Shikra, and therefore, when necessary, the Nekudas HaEmes can be moved. And as we roll up, we will move the Nekudas HaEmes along, try and keeping all the chassis together as much as we can. And remember, we needed to keep all the chassis with the right tension. So, since by nature of string, when you roll it up, don't stay on top of each other nicely, sometimes you will need to take another Kanei HaOrgim. The next thing we need to do is lift off from the end. We now have enough chassis loose that we can pass it through our nirin, and we attach our Koved Elyon to the loom over here, and we can thread using our lace rods. We can thread each chassis through the right hole in the nearing. Remember, number 1 goes through the back one, number 2 will go through the front one, and then number 1 will be lifted first, number 2 will be lifted second, and so on and so forth. Now that we've finished Mesach, we've got our warp threads, our chassis threads on the loom, or ready to be on the loom, we can work out what the next malacha is of Oise Shnei Botei Nir. Now we said a base nir is a string with a hole in the middle, right, held onto a frame, like we have over here. And Oise Shnei Botei Nir, according to some of our Shim, is that we make the Shnei Botei Nir. We make 2 of these heddles, and the way to do that is to use a heddle board, and that way you make sure that every time you make a hole, you make a knot, it's always in the right place. You start up your old piece of string around the edge, tie a knot over this beam, over this peg, another knot under the nut peg, that is your base nir in the middle little hole, tie it up at the bottom, and you've made a base nir. That's one pshat in Oise Shnei Botei Nir. Tosfos Rid says that Oise Shnei Botei Nir is not making the base Botei Nir. That would be kosher, makabapatish. Oise Shnei Botei Nir is taking these nirin, moving them off the heddle board, and putting them onto the harness. You take them off, you pull off this end of the harness, and you slip on a heddle or 2, and you put it onto your nirin, onto the harness, and then your nirin is ready to be used, as we said, to lift up the chassis one by one. The Kovid Elyon, back to our loom, all ready with the chassis on, with the Kinei chassis wrapped up to keep the tension correct. Further down, as we've got the lace rods with an akudas ha'emes held in between, first green, then red, green, red. Next comes the harnesses, the nirin, and red thread number 1 goes through the eye of the heddle number 1, in harness number 1. When it comes through past that, it will go in between the nirin of number 2. We'll see that in a moment. But green thread, which is number 2, goes in between the 2 heddles of the first harness, and therefore when we lift up the red harness, the first harness, only the reds go up and the greens stay down because they're not held into position. In the second harness, we said the reds go in between the nirin, and when we pull it up, we pull up the greens, they go up, and they're held in the eyes of the heddles, which are in the second harness. Then you pass your chassis threads through the kirus, which is there as a comb to bang home any weaving that you've done. When you've done that, you tie your chassis on to the kovet tachten, where they're held, and then you can get on with weaving. You lift up the greens, you pass your HaRav through, drop it, lift up the reds, pass your HaRav through over the greens, drop it again, bang with the kirus, and so on and so forth. Which is the next malacha of Oreg. Lift up the greens, pass your shuttle through the shed, pull it through, and we've done Oreg. Bang it home with the kirus, and you've done medakdek according to some Rishonim. On the way back, we pull up the reds, pass it through over the greens, try again over the greens, pull it through. Now over here we have what is called the Nefesh HaMaseches. We have a slanting piece of thread that has been thrown through, the weaver has taken his shuttle, thrown it through the shed, over the greens, under the reds, and now it's left on a diagonal piece. Now sometimes he'll throw it too hard. If he throws it too hard, the side gets drawn in, and that's no good. So he has to take a sharp instrument, a karka, and be makeh b'karka, the base of gimel makomas, to create bubbles, and that way he's drawn in more thread into more of the area of thread into the cloth, or into the meseches, and then he can bang it home with the kirus, and hopefully that will get him a uniform piece of cloth. He goes backwards and forwards, each time making sure it's not too tight, not too loose, bang it home with the kirus, and that way he'll build up a piece of cloth on his loom. When he can no longer bang the kirus, alternatively he can no longer lift up the greens and create a shed, because if it's got his weaving is all the way up to here, it becomes less and less, more and more difficult to be able to pull anything up. So therefore what he needs to do is he needs to take out the Yisad HaOreg mentioned by Shoftim, by Shimshon, the Yisad of the peg that holds in the Kovid, and he'll have to find somebody else to help him to undo the peg on the back, on the Kovid Elyon at the top end, and then together they'll roll up the beged onto the Kovid Tachten, unwind the Shesi from the Kovid Elyon, and then he can carry on weaving, because he's fed in more Shesi into the area that he does the weaving. He's wrapped up his cloth at the bottom end, and he can carry on weaving. And as we said, however much Shesi he's prepared, however long his pegs were, how far away his pegs were, he prepared, he wrapped it all up, however much Shesi he's got on here, he can carry on weaving. And that is how they did the weaving in the time of the Mishkan, the time of Chazal. They did weaving on a loom with the Kovet Tachten, the beged getting the Erev, the Shesi fixed, the Erev going backwards and forwards, and that way you create the beged. After we've done Oreg, comes the next malacha of Peitzea. Peitzea, according to the Gaon and the Ravid, fits in very nicely over here, is cutting it off the loom. You take a pair of scissors and you start cutting, and as soon as you cut 2 threads, you're ready over on Peitzea. Peitzea, shtei chutim, you cut 2 chutim off the loom, and you're done the malacha of Peitzea, getting ready a beged. The malacha after that is kosher u'mateh. So when you've got your piece of cloth which has come off the loom, you then have all this nice, the shesis, the greens and the reds, and the erev. Now this is going to come apart very soon, very quickly. So therefore, you are kosher. You tie up the threads. If you tie up the shesi threads, that stops the erevs coming out and getting lost. And therefore, you have a good piece of beged. And mateh, if you made a mistake, you tied it up wrong, you might want to untie it, so that's kosher, and then mateh. You find these things on a talis. If you look at the edge of your talis, you will find the modern replication of these knots that you do at the end of the shesi. The shesi goes across the talis, ends up with these threads at the end, and then tie them in a knot, and it can't fray. After Kaishel Matir, and you've got your beged, the next malacha is Teifer, because with one piece of cloth you can make a talis. If you want to make a suit, you're going to have to stitch pieces of cloth together. So the next malacha is Teifer, and again, you tied it up, you sewed it up too tightly, you need to loosen something, that will be Korea. Teifer and Korea, the next malachas, and that is the 13 malachas of making begodim. Just to read through them again, we have Goizes esatzemeh, getting rid of the sheep, Melabnai, washing out all the dirt, Menatzoi, separating it and disentangling it, ready to be spun, Tsoivai, putting the colour into it, Teiver, spinning it into a thread, Meisach, spreading it out, laying it out ready to be put onto the loom, Oisa Shnei Botinirin, filling the heddles in the loom, Oreg, weaving the cloth, Oreg Shnei Chutim, Peitzer Shnei Chutim, cutting 2 threads off, Kosher, Matir, tying, untying, Teifer Shtei Tefirus, sewing 2 stitches, V'Karei Manos Litva, and ripping, tearing, in order to be able to stitch it up again. And to finish off, the Gemara in Yuma, Daf Ayin Beis. Tana Mishmei Reb Nechemia, Roikeim Maasei Machat, Lefikach Patzuf Echad. Choshev Maasei Oreg, Lefikach Shtei Patzufos. If you look at the pictures, you learn the psukim of how they built the Mishkan. The Perechis in the Mishkan was made Maasei Oreg, Maasei Choshev, and Maasei Roikeim. The Gemara is telling us that Maasei Roikeim is done with a needle, and therefore Patzuf Echad. The same picture was on both sides. You did your needle through the cloth and you embroidered the picture, the same picture on both sides. If it's Maasei Choshev, then it's Maasei Oreg, you're doing it with weaving, and therefore you get a two shtei patzufos, an ari mitzad echad, v'neshem mitzad echad. On the perichas, you've got a lion on one side, an eagle on the other side, 2 different pictures with one piece of cloth. Now many people think this was done by a nes. And as Mashver puts it, if you still think that it's done by a nes, then that's a nes that he can reproduce, and he will take ritlach. If we have a look at this piece of cloth over here on the loom, we have a blue piece with a little bit of yellow. Now, I'm going to do a trick, because it's going to be the same loom, same piece of cloth. If we look at the other side, it's changed. It's now mostly green, yet light green, and only a small bit blue. What happened? It's one piece. You can see this. It's all one piece. It's all being woven together. And the answer to that is that we learnt about sheds. And if we hold this up and we make a shed in our piece of cloth, we can then either pass our shuttle through the shed, alternatively, we can pass it under one on the top half. And carefully thread through the upper shed, where as the lower part of the wall of chassis hasn't been touched. If we push all this into where it's meant to go, then it'll join up with the yellows, and it won't be so visible on the other side. If we do a different colour on the other side on this lower shed, then we will get this type of pattern, that the top half of the cloth has been woven one way, the bottom half of the cloth has been woven with a different colour, different pattern. We then close that and carry on weaving like normal under 1/2, and that way we build up the whole cloth, one piece of cloth, and parts of it we can lift up, we can make 2 sheds and weave a different pattern on one side to the other, and there you have an Ari mitzad echad and Neshem mitzad acher. Thank you for listening.